An anonymous author says that grace is getting what you don't deserve, and mercy is not getting what you do deserve. This morning I chose to preach on Jacob and his wrestling match. I'm saying wrestling, not wrestling. I was been taught over the years that it's wrestling, not wrestling. And his wrestling... You can't break a habit in 39 plus years. I chose to preach on Jacob and his wrestling match with an angel. Be it celestial, or some people think maybe it was a demon he was wrestling with. Or God, as God's self. And I chose it because this community, the individuals in this community, have been and still are wrestling, struggling with questions that appear to have no answers. We are wrestling as a community over the events of the last week and a half concerning the loss of a young member of our community. And the recent loss of one allows us to remember the loss of all those who have died in the past for, from our vantage point, no good reason. And we struggle with the situations of the world and the appearance that evil is gaining the upper hand. And we've also been struggling and wrestling over the last few years, long before I arrived on the scene, of this community and how to widen it while preserving the perceived comfortableness that is associated with it, and remaining a beacon of life-giving light to others. Now, I know you've been listening to the Old Testament reading, the Hebrew Bible reading, these last few Sundays. We've been hearing about Jacob these last few weeks. Jacob and Esau. Jacob and Esau were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Jacob and Esau were twins. And remember, they struggled in the womb together, and Esau was born first. And right after came Jacob with his hand on Esau's heel. Now, Jacob was a mama's boy. I can relate to that. And Esau liked to be in the outdoors, not really hanging around home. So Esau one day had been working in the fields, was probably famished. He came home, came into the camp, and Jacob had been making some food. Remember the stew, the red stew. And Esau asked for some of it. And Jacob, sensing a vulnerability in Esau, said, "Sure, I'll give you some of my food in exchange for your birthright." The birthright of being the oldest son in that time. Then later on, Jacob and his mother tricked Isaac, the father, into giving Jacob the blessing that was given to the eldest son, which should have been Esau. And Esau, going against his granddaddy's edict that he was not to marry a Canaanite woman, didn't help the situation because he did marry a Canaanite woman. So his father didn't really help him get back his birthright. Animosity grew between the brothers, and it was intense. Esau chased Jacob and was going to kill him. if he ever caught up to him. And with the help of his mother, Jacob fled to a relative, Uncle Laban, and worked for him. And there he got his wives, and he became wealthy. There's a year span of almost 20 years here at the time he left, and at this point. But now things are souring with the in-laws. And God tells Jacob it's time to leave. It's time to go back. 20 years have passed. Esau, powerful in his own right, now says that he forgives Jacob. That is where we pick up the story today. Has Esau really forgiven Jacob for all the things that Jacob did to Esau? Do people change? And from what perspective do we ask that question? When we change, do we not think that others can change as well? Or maybe because we haven't changed, we think others can't change. Jacob isn't quite convinced that Esau has changed, and has made plans to protect himself if things don't go well with the reunion of the brothers. And one plan was to go ahead and send his family across the river into Esau's territory and see how they're treated. So Jacob does that. Yeah, it's not a great plan for the family. It's great for him. And Jacob does that. He sends all his family and all his things. Jacob is left on the far side of the river with nothing. No one and no thing. He's alone there that night, thinking, I bet, about what he had done to Esau. Thinking about would he be so forgiving as Esau was, even though 20 years have passed. And Jacob is thinking, well, now it's time to face up to it. That's when a stranger approaches. Is it Esau, perhaps, who has come in from behind? Or maybe Jacob is dreaming like he did that last time he was alone at Bethel, dreaming of the ladder with the angels ascending and descending. Or maybe it's his inner demons arousing him in his sleep. One way to domesticate the story. Now just imagine this story, just for a moment, being told orally to a community gathered around the communal fire thousands of years ago, before it was written down. Now some think that parts of this story are older than the Hebrew nation itself, and that these parts were incorporated by the ancient Hebrews into their own story. Regardless, this story is as ancient as the days, wrestling with all that comes in and with the dark. Fear of what we've done and why we've done it. And fear of what we've left undone and why we didn't do it. Thinking about, can we perceive of others forgiving us of what we've done to them out of our own inability to forgive them if they had done these same things to us? Of course, the indifferent, the monsters who walk among us, don't ask these questions. Those who are indifferent don't have to think of the lies told to get what they didn't deserve, and the lies they've told to push others to the end of the line for what they did deserve. The indifferent, sad to say, have lost their intimacy with God, have lost their knowledge of the interconnectedness between themselves and all of creation. Now, last week I talked to you about the intimacy of the dance that God does with us and we do with God. Well, wrestling is also an intimate act. The embrace of two in an attempt to throw one down. So that night, Jacob embraces the stranger, who we presume is God, in a wrestling match. And he will not let him go until he gets his blessing. This time, Jacob had to fight without his conniving and his cunning and deceptions that he had used so many times to take from others. Those times of convincing himself that what he was doing was for the best, when it was really only best for him. This night, that convincing wasn't going to work in this fight. He had to fight face to face this time to get what he really wanted. And this time, Jacob, all alone on the far side of the river, with no one and nothing, was not looking for riches or things, but a blessing of God. Unpredictably, God had searched out Jacob, despite Jacob's many, many, and deep imperfections. And Jacob came away with his blessing and a new name, Israel. One who strives with God. And the cost for that blessing and new name, was a limp. A reminder to him and to us that encounters with God, those times we wrestle with God about who died and who lived, those nights we wrestle about our fears of loss and what the future might have in store for us, that limp, that uncomfortableness is a reminder that God is there. Some way, God is in it. God is there in these life-changing encounters and paradigm shifters. And yes, we may walk away with a limp. We may never be comfortable again. But God doesn't promise us comfort. God does promise us a blessing, a tremendous blessing for the encounter, the ongoing struggle that may not result in the answers we want, and sometimes doesn't appear to result in any answers at all. Striving with God is our new name. And as Christians, we can strive with God and look at God's face as God looks back into our faces. And what we didn't hear today from the gospel, or from the Genesis reading, but it's just a few passages over, is this. Esau was sincere in his forgiveness. And upon Esau seeing his brother Jacob and running to embrace him in love, Jacob said to him, To see your face is like seeing the face of God. So let it be with all of us. Amen.
Amen.